How's it going? Woo! That was inspiring. That music made me feel like I can do anything. Gonna get me through the next 6 weeks of this election. How about it? Oh my gosh, it is such an honor to be sharing the stage with you.
You as well. It's so good to meet you.
It's amazing. Representation matters, y'all. I mean, gender in journalism, we are trying to do this differently, and we know that we have to because we are not a special interest group. We are half the population, and we are part of the emerging small d Democratic majority of this country. So yes, why wouldn't we be talking about ourselves that way? But they're not. So here we are.
Here we
the
are.
19th and the Meteor doing our thing.
Here we are.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am good. How are y'all?
Great.
Amazing, amazing.
Awesome
Well, listen,
crowd.
thank you. I just want to say thank you so much to IWPR, first of all, for having
Absolutely.
us. And thank you to so many of you who represent so many of the organizations that help us sound smarter and help us do the work that we do. So thank you, thank you, thank you for your work, and thank you for helping us to do our work. So, should we get into it?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Let's do it. I think we should probably just start off the conversation with kind of how did you get into your current role? Like, what was your journey to the Meteor?
What was my journey to the Meteor? So, yeah, that's a great question. So I started, and I think Kate was talking about this earlier, in feminist blogging at the turn of the century.
Yes, Google it, folks.
Yeah.
If you don't know what.
I mean, back in the
those
days
words
of
mean.
movable type and live journal, actually. Yeah, so I had started, I was a women's studies major in undergrad. I had met the founder of Feministing, Jessica Valenti,
Yes.
in undergrad, who is now, running Abortion Every Day and doing critical abortion reporting every single day. And which kind of led to a 20-year career of writing and editing, and which led to a couple of years ago, I joined the newsroom at Mike News, which was very popular in, I guess, almost 10 years ago now.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Time flies when you are
It really does.
trying to do this differently.
And I think, and this is why I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, is, there was this moment happening. It was 2015, 2016. Anything felt possible at that time,
Sure.
from what was possible for women leaders, what was possible for people of color in newsrooms. And Mike really hit the scene as really trying to take, I think, a lot of the work that we had done in the blogosphere, which, blogs were really a response to the fact that mainstream media failed to cover the lives and needs of disenfranchised populations. And that was really, what blogs were a response to, and specifically blogs like the one where I was at Feministing. And so Mike really tried to bring that to a new generation, and they were using social media and all of these different tools, and I had the delight of hiring a really diverse team that was kind of covering issues at the intersection of the issues that we care about. That, started what we now know as kind of this really big and important moment in how identity plays out in online spaces. And so I lost the job at Mike, which I recently wrote a book about, and that whole experience. But I then was hired to be the executive editor at Teen Vogue. And Teen Vogue kind of got on the scene right after Trump was elected,
Yes.
when it was very clear that Gen Z was not for this, and they needed more than fashion content. They wanted politics content. And
It was not our Teen Vogue.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Your leaders seriously, give it up. Under your leadership, that was not the Teen Vogue that a lot of us grew up with. Absolutely.
Thank you. So yeah, and that's how I ended up meeting the founder of The Meteor, who is the former editor-in-chief of Glamour magazine, who similarly had kind of worked in women's media for a long time and wanted to create something that was really targeted specifically on the experiences of women, and specifically disenfranchised women, and how we can kind of elevate and prioritize those stories.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that intersectionality has been a conversation and a through line for this conference because it matters, and because how do you have conversations about gender without having conversations about race, without having conversations about all of the things, right? I think that really just can help us get to a more honest and accurate place about the stories that we tell about this country, right?
Yeah. So tell us about yourself, Errin. How did you end up at the 19th?
Woo! So yeah, I mean, actually, I spent most of my career in journalism at the Associated Press, which was my journalism home for the better part of a decade. I also worked at the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times, and really kind of always gravitated towards those who was not being seen and who was not being heard, right? Those untold stories, and really journalism that was on behalf of so many of the people in my community that could not go to places and spaces that I could go to talk about things that were directly impacting their lives, right? But I would say at the beginning of my career, my approach to covering issues of race, politics, that was much more about kind of the vestiges of racism and the progress that had been made, the gains that had been won, and kind of the fruits of that. This is 20 years ago. Fast forward to the modern protest movements, the Me Too movement, all the things that we've seen that feel like such a retrenchment and such a loss of the hard-fought gains, and also things that people thought were kind of settled law and policy and norms in this country that just have been completely upended, right, in our lifetimes in a way that I think so many people didn't see, but I also think that there were some people who did think that this was entirely possible, namely women, LGBTQ plus people, and people of color, right? And yet our stories were not centered nearly enough of the story of what it means to have a truly representative, equitable democracy. So 2016 covered that election, right, where people couldn't vote for that woman. It wasn't that they wouldn't vote for any woman, but just not that one, right? So then fast forward to the 2019, the Democratic primary, 6 women are running for president, the most diverse group of folks who would ever run for president, and yet we were still covering race and gender in our politics in a way that felt so stale, just not, like I said, honest and accurate about where we were as a democracy and where we were in our politics. And what I came to realize was, of course, you're not going to have different stories when the gatekeepers and the storytellers are still male and pale overwhelmingly, right? So, I mean, goodbye. That was not just a function of the newsroom where I worked. It was pervasive throughout political journalism, right? So, for me, my now CEO, Emily Ramshaw, who was at the Texas Tribune, kind of granddaddy of nonprofit journalism, said, I have this idea for this newsroom I want to start that focuses on women in politics. And I was like, sign me up, go raise some money and let's do it. Because for me, the risk was not in this scary new startup. It was in staying in legacy media and hoping that they would make a choice that they hadn't made in the entire time that I'd been in my career, right? So we launched a week before the Iowa caucuses in 2020, and now here we are covering our second presidential election. And if you told me a woman was going to be on the ballot already, again, I would not have believed it, but here we are, and let's go. Because, I mean, gender was already on the ballot with toxic masculinity front and center, but now it's even more stark, and we can look at what representation does and does not mean in terms of gender, not just at the top of the ticket, but also the people that are going to be choosing who our next president is. And so that just really feels like my best and highest work as a journalist. Because like if we are not telling our stories, we are not telling the story. Yeah. So, yeah.
Wait, so I have a question for you on this.
Okay.
Knowing that you came from the Associated Press. So I think we've heard a lot today and yesterday about the importance of representation and why we should be here. But coming from a place like the AP, I imagine there was a lot of internal battles you had to fight.
Oh, yeah.
And we can kind of all agree, the more we see stories that reflect our lives, the better it is for our lives, right? But as journalists, often we fight these internal battles because there's this assumption that when you're a journalist, you're objective. And so when you focus on race and gender, then you are unable to clearly see a picture because you have your own preconceived biases, as though other people don't have biases.
As though whiteness is not an identity.
Exactly.
Right? 1,000%. So yeah, I mean, and certainly when we were coming up, objectivity was the gold standard of journalism. The Associated Press was the gold standard of journalism. And so much of my early career was rooted in kind of, getting those fundamentals, and also, there was definitely a certain way that an Associated Press story looked when it went out on the wire. And a lot of times that did not mean that that was a place, and journalism in general, not a place where they saw my lived experience as an asset to my storytelling as opposed to a liability, right? We are uniquely positioned to tell the story of this country, right? Because our story is American history. It's not the other way around, right? You know, Black history, women's history, like that's American history. And so, and that is the American story. So to have folks who didn't understand that, or who, for some reason, would try to challenge the idea that it was actually more factual to do stories from that perspective, right? Like, I think it mattered. And even before, like, there were so many times in my career, you know, when I was at the AP, that I was making choices about whose voices I was amplifying, looking around and saying, who is not in this story that needs to be in this story? And it was not always something that they noticed, but you know, you can read a story that quotes all white men, for example, or all white people. Nobody says anything, you know, but if I would write a story and the only people I was quoting were Black women as experts, as voters, right? What's wrong with that? That's accurate. That's you know, like that. I can tell a story about education. I can tell a story about people who care about the Supreme Court, or people who are faith voters, or you know, I can do that with people who are not necessarily someone's default setting, which is really what objectivity was all about, right? Like, I mean, I think for people like us, that was always a myth, right? Because when your default setting is white and male, that is what objectivity is about: your comfort at the expense of others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, right. Yeah, we're going to end this on a high note. So, no, I mean, but like that is literally why we exist. So, I mean, I want to talk about, I mean, like journalism, like you said, you were a women's studies major, but you end up with journalism as your career path. Why was journalism the vehicle that you chose, you know, as a path to change?
Absolutely. So I think I was like planning on, I didn't really know what I was going to do with my life.
Me
to
either.
be honest.
My mom told me to get a job
Yeah.
because I wasn't coming home after
Yeah,
college.
like my parents didn't, like they were like, we immigrated to the United States for you to study women's
Wow.
studies. Like they were, you know, they were like, really?
Not their American dream
No,
for you.
not their American. They were like, well, you know, I mean, it's all, you know, whatever. It's
Shout
like,
out to immigrant mom
Yeah.
and dad. It worked out, though.
They're like,
It
maybe
worked
you
out.
can be a lawyer. You know, like they were just like, we don't understand this. And so, yeah, I didn't totally know exactly what I wanted to do, but I understood that, you know, it was a little bit of an awakening for me where I was like, we are all part of systems, and there are ways that we are consciously and subconsciously complicit in systems that lead to our own oppression. And how do I get the message out about that? I mean, it
Yes.
was very earnest and very, you know, I was a big activist in the 90s. I was a student activist. And so it was something that I'd always been invested in. But it wasn't really until I started blogging that I realized the power of the written word. I know that sounds so corny, but it was like, you know, we were writing and people were reading. And we were like, wait, people are reading. And then all of a sudden we started to go viral. And all of a sudden we have 1 million views a month. And that's a big deal in like 2007,
Hello,
right?
yes.
You know, and so we're like, oh, wait, people are craving this content. And Jessica and her sister Vanessa, who founded the outlet, their whole thing was like they had Googled young women in politics, and they got like a one-sheeter from the Ms. Foundation, or like bless their heart, like it was great, but it was still like there was no spaces for young people to be talking about the issues that impacted their lives. And that's when I started to see that when I was truthful, when I was honest, when I started to question things, that people were listening and there was an audience for it. And that ended up, you know, really turning into what I realized I was passionate about. I mean, and I'm sure you've experienced this too. Like, I love when a story goes viral. I love when a story that I care about, that's important, that, you know, moves hearts and minds, gets engaged with, because it proves a point, right?
Yes.
Everyone's like, nobody cared about your story, and it's like, haha, you were wrong.
So many people care.
So many
Watch
people
this.
care.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, look, I think same as you. I mean, I was not born into like a journalism dynasty family. Did not, you know, it was not entering the world with ink in my veins. But, you know, there were certainly some things about me that set me up well to do this job. One, I was nosy as hell as a child. That's always a good indicator that journalism might be the career for you. Also, I mean, just love to talk. If you were that person in school that got on your report that you talk too much, journalism might also be for you. And I just love to learn about new things all the time. My attention span is zero. And so it's like, oh, what can I learn today? What can I learn tomorrow that I didn't learn today? What can I learn the next day that I didn't learn earlier this week? Like, that is what journalism, that is the gift of journalism each and every single day, is that I'm going to encounter somebody, I'm going to learn something that I didn't already know, and I can, like, as a black woman, like, my sense of right and wrong and fairness and and pointing out inequality when I see it, like, that is in me. Like, I'm from Atlanta, so also being a Southern black woman, I think, has a lot to do with that. And journalism is a way to right wrongs, and or at least to point out wrongs and say that this is not okay, and to leave a record, whether that thing changes or not. Like, you can mark that thing with journalism, and so that was part of what I wanted to do. I also wanted to reflect the wholeness of our humanity, right? As black people, later as women, and I will tell y'all, like I said, I covered race for most of my life. By the time I left to start the 19th, I was the Associated Press's national writer on race and ethnicity. So, like, my dream job, I wanted this job from the time I was an intern at the AP. Like, I literally get to talk about whatever I wanted on race, and specifically black folks, for a huge audience. I mean, the Associated Press is a global journalism organization, and I get to do that. And that was like the honor of my life. It was my dream job. And yet, the reason that this is my dream job now is because coming to the 19th was really the first time that I had, quite honestly, the privilege of thinking not only about how race impacts how we are able to function and participate in this democracy, but to be able to think about how gender impacts how we function and participate in this democracy. And I was like, oh my, this is why white women are all up in feminism, because they don't have to think about their race as the thing that holds them back. They can focus on the other thing, which is gender. For us, like, you cannot separate, again, the intersectionality piece, right? Like, you cannot separate those two things. So for me, even as a black woman, like, that is the lens that I bring to this work. That is how I think about how this democracy functions and who it does not function for. I just, and so being able to illustrate that through the work that we do, like, I feel your sense of urgency around that even from a young age. Like, you still very much have that in your youthful appearance, despite the fact that you've been in this industry for as long as you have. I mean, so obviously we are trying mightily to represent, but I wonder what you think about our beloved profession and how the rest of journalism is doing when it comes to representing gender equity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's worth, I love everything you're saying in terms of how you kind of made the transition, and also I think the role that the 19th is playing. One of the things that I think we focus a lot on diversity and representation. While those things are important, I think one of the things, and the 19th does this really well, and I have an example from the Meteor that I'd love to share, is when you tell these stories in ways that are provocative and interesting and resource-driven, they actually have an impact on policy. I mean, ultimately we're here to talk about policy and how policy impacts our lives, right, as disenfranchised communities. And I feel like that's something that I love so much about the 19th, is like, the mission of the 19th is very clear. When you go to it, it's like, we're not just reporting, we're reporting to make a difference.
Yes.
Like, we are going to put this story out, and people are going to look at these numbers, and they can't say, you can't say I didn't tell you.
Yes.
when you put that bill together, when you put that, when we see these regressive laws passing at the state level, we know exactly what the consequences of them are.
And for folks who are not only wanting this information, but wanting this information so that they can be empowered to act. Right, exactly. To be empowered to participate in this democracy, whether that's through organizing, whether that's through voting, whether that is through, just spreading the word about policy that is impacting people's lives, right? Like, that should be what this is for.
Yep. So to answer your question about the state of the industry, one of the things that I've covered for the last 20 years, whichever outlet I'm at, is the state of reproductive rights in this country, and the impact of our declining access to abortion, which is now, I read, or somebody funny on TikTok posted, is now like a blue state luxury, is having access to abortion, which I was like, oh, that did not feel great. And for how much longer? Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because guess what? Your ER is going to be flooded too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the role that the media has kind of played in the cutback of abortion rights, in this kind of fear in covering the issue, and this anxiety in covering it, and also which led to an anxiety of our political leaders talking about it. I mean, this is the most we've ever seen any political party talk about
The
abortion.
first presidential election post-Roe.
Yeah.
And also, let's be honest, the ignorance
Yeah.
of folks making these laws and the ignorance of folks who are supposedly covering this issue because, hello, they're not in a position to ever be pregnant.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. They're not in a position to ever have to worry about their reproductive care.
Yeah.
Right? But somebody they know, somebody they care about, somebody they're related to is, but have never had to ask questions
Yeah.
about any of this until now. And so, yes, we're seeing those gaps, I would say.
No, absolutely.
As the continuing changing landscape of and even just the approach to covering it, right? I mean, this is, yes, obviously this, our politics is how we got to this decision, but the consequences of this are real life. They're people, stories, every single day. Who is telling most of those stories? Women, LGBTQ folks, people of color who see the folks in their communities and their lives being directly impacted by this. Most of the white men that you see that are writing about the post-Roe landscape are writing about it in terms of the politics of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that is what they are comfortable with. Those are the stories that they are comfortable telling. Joe Biden is never going to have a baby.
Yeah.
Not giving birth. He couldn't give birth. So why are we more focused on what this means for Joe Biden than we were on what this means for, the woman in the Deep South who has no access to care, and what that means for her? That Amber Thurman story.
Yeah.
That is the work that is the story that we need to be telling.
Absolutely.
On the other side of this decision, not just about the political stakes of this for any candidate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the stories we worked on last year, and I think you've done quite a bit of coverage on it as well, was Amanda Zarowski,
Yes.
who was a married woman in Texas who, affluent white woman who had a wanted pregnancy, goes into a miscarriage, and the doctor is like, we can't treat you here because it's not life-threatening enough, whatever that means. But she basically went into sepsis,
Yes.
and when you're in sepsis, you can't move. It's a big risk to fly her somewhere else to a state where she could get care. And so we basically met with Amanda. We told her story, and that story eventually went viral.
Yes.
And Amanda ended up invited to the State of the Union as a guest and was on the stage at the DNC. And that to me is a living example of the ways that when you tell these stories, we're not a heavily funded outlet. There's I have a team of 4 people and freelance, right? But why was not a bigger outlet talking about that story, right? And so we were able to then partner with other outlets to get the story, like the 19th, to get the story out there. But to me, that is one example of why these outlets matter so much. And I know you have so many of those.
Yeah, I mean, I'm frankly, ProPublica has been doing the Lord's work, and I mean, that story about Amber Thurman puts her story on the vice president's radar. Her family is literally, within days of that story running, her family is up there with her and Oprah doing this town hall, telling their story to the country. We didn't know her story, but we knew that there was somebody out there like that. We knew, is it any surprise that the first person who was, a casualty of this Supreme Court decision was a black woman in the South? Absolutely not. We just needed to put a name and a face on her, and now ProPublica has done that. And it is very impactful, right? And it is influencing, frankly, look, we also said going into this year that abortion was on the ballot. Reproductive rights are on the ballot for people. And I also appreciate places that are not just asking women about abortion on the ballot for them, asking men, asking LGBTQ folks. We've done a lot of coverage at the 19th around trans folks who can also become pregnant, but also the trans folks and LGBTQ plus people who have been getting gender-affirming care at so many of the places that are now closed because of what has happened, right? Where do they go for care? Nobody was thinking about them, or maybe they were thinking about them, who knows? But the point is, the other things, I mean, yes, of course IVF is going to be an issue, right? And for folks who either have been covering this for a long time like you, or who just have the lived experience that is going to make them think about these kinds of things, newsrooms that are recognizing that that is an asset to telling the story and getting the story right, like I really, really feel like that matters, not just in this moment, but in going forward as we continue to think about what journalism can be and should be, who it's for, and why we're doing this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess we should talk about the 2024 of it all a little bit. Gender, I mean, because look, like I said, women are half the population and half the electorate, right? So we have to talk about how, I mean, women are going to be the deciders of this election. And so how are you thinking about the work that you are doing and in service to those voters in particular?
Yeah, I'm so anxious.
Yeah, keep it real.
Because I think that it's really easy to believe everything you see on the internet and to get very caught up in momentum, which is exciting. I think momentum is exciting, but I also think as a journalist, I'm always like, okay, what's the piece of this story that's missing,
Yes.
right? Like, who are the people that aren't enthusiastic right now? Who are the people that are not feeling this momentum? Because those were major oversights in 2016 and like deep regrets that I have in terms of how we covered stories, how, I mean, also looking at 2016, this is before Facebook had really crumbled as a possible vehicle for storytelling, right? I mean, many of the news and digital outlets that I've worked in, and many of the ones that we've seen shuttered after the 2016 election because of the role that Facebook played in, clickbait, in creating clickbait. And so I was working in a newsroom, and I know many people were in newsrooms where they were like, make the headline. Like, I remember actually a conversation of like being like, oh, Facebook's really responding to Bernie. Let's write about Bernie. Like literally like having the algorithm decide.
It was just about the trends.
Yeah, it was about the trends. And so now I'm really like, what is the actual story? How do we tell the story despite the trends? Knowing that as an outlet, for us to survive, we need clicks, right? And that is still true. We still need a certain amount of engagement. And and so that is something that I've just been thinking about a lot, is like, how do we tell these stories in a way that's fair, that resonates, that kind of cuts through the noise, but also recognizes that right now, what is considered accurate and what is considered truthful is like very messy.
Yeah, and that women, people of color, are being disproportionately targeted by mis and disinformation. We know this. But I think this is why it is also so important. I mean, you talk about stories that have the potential to go viral. When we are on the ground, when we are centering voters in the conversation about this election, hearing about the things that they care about and the things that are happening in their lives that are impacting potentially how they do or do not participate in this democracy, those are the stories that I feel like really have the potential to resonate with folks. And so those are but those take resources, as I don't have to tell you, right? For us to travel.
They also ruffle feathers.
Yes. For us to travel, for us to be traveling safely, frankly, as women trying to cover this issue in particular, it is not easy.
Yeah.
And so, I mean.
How are you thinking about the 2024 of it all?
I mean, obviously, we are thinking about, what gender means at the top of the ticket, how that is showing up and what it means and how it is informing what people want to do with the ballot box, but also thinking about the issues that matter to our audiences. We can have a very specific conversation with those folks when they say affordability is my most important issue. Well, that's going to be a very nuanced answer if we actually talk to people. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, maybe somebody means student loans. Maybe somebody means where I'm living. Maybe somebody means my ability to start a family. But talking to different people about what that issue means instead of just kind of running with poll results and numbers and not the people behind them. Like, we're really trying to dig into that because we don't want to be surprised on the other side of this election, right? Thinking about the people that power our democracy, poll workers are disproportionately women. They are scared. They didn't sign up for harassment and violence in trying to facilitate the business of democracy. So, like, I mean, we're thinking about a lot of those things. But what we are not doing is horse race, who's up, who's down, because that is not what is informing and empowering people in this moment. I guess we should probably end on a hopeful, positive. No, I mean, you know, what encourages you about this moment in journalism, particularly around gender and our ability to really create narrative change in how we do this work?
I will say what has been encouraging me is that we're not fixating on it the way that we did in 2016, in the sense that it's kind of just assumed. Like, these questions of, like, are we ready for a black woman president? Like, people are like, what? Stop asking that.
She's the candidate.
Yeah, like, stop asking that question. And I've seen so much backlash to that, and to me that does suggest that we're getting to what I loved the word you used, curious. We're getting to a more curious place about what we want from our leaders that go beyond just what our embodiment is. And I think that is all we've ever really asked for, is to see the full humanity of somebody and to fully understand what the consequences of their decision, all of, like, we've wanted a more complete picture. And that has actually been feeling more true than I think 10 years ago, where we were a little fresh out of water, or 8 years ago, where it was a little bit like just such a focus on it that, like, people would get distracted. You know, like, it was not as much about, like, what you're saying of, like, how voters actually respond to this or how they're feeling about these conversations. And that is giving me hope that it kind of, like, I don't want to say we're past it, because obviously, like, we still live in a really racist, sexist country, but it's
not post-racial or post-gender.
Exactly, but it is encouraging that, like, I haven't seen the same type of, like, we can't do, you know, it's kind of just like, yeah, obviously, you know, and that's something I've really learned from Gen Z too, when they're like, yeah, obviously, you know, like,
obviously,
like,
yes.
Obviously, like, we don't need to talk about that, you know.
Maybe that's our new startup name,
Yeah, obviously. That's a good one. You heard it here first.
You heard it here first, it's on tape.
about
No,
you?
but I mean, normalizing the leadership of people who have not
Yeah.
always looked like the people that have been in leadership, and normalizing people's participation in democracy is how we expand our imagination about who gets to participate in our politics and our society. So I look forward to your continued work on this, and I'm so glad to be in fellowship with you around this type of storytelling, because we know that it has the power to make change.
Absolutely. I feel the same way.
Thank y'all.